It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And, of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. In this segment, no exception. It is a subject, I promise you, that in 700-odd shows we have never talked about, and that is finding and naming bodies across the country. We're going to be talking to interesting woman indeed. Her name is Deborah Halber. She is an author of a brand new book called The Skeleton Crew. She's a journalist, and she delves into the macabre world of armchair detectives. A vague introduction indeed, but Deborah, how are you, my friend?
How are you doing today?
Well, we're good. Let's do this. Before we dive into The Skeleton Crew and all things Skeleton Crew, tell us, our Lewis at Large listeners across Northeast Kansas, a little bit about your background.
Well, I started out as a reporter, and then I became a science writer. But this topic is really something I came across pretty much by accident.
And what kind of reporting did you do?
I was a general assignment reporter. I worked at newspapers in Boston and New Hampshire and elsewhere around New England.
Okay, so tell us conceptually about the people that you're writing about. We'll dive specifically into the book and some specific stories in a little bit, but tell us in general, the people that you are writing about, what do they do?
It's a group of people. They're scattered all across the country. At first glance, they don't seem to really have anything in common. But what they've become kind of challenged by and obsessed with is the idea that you can match unidentified remains to missing people. With the advent of the Internet, some of these databases started to be created where there were descriptions of unidentified remains, bodies that had been found in various states or counties. And there were also missing person reports. So they started actually compiling this information in separate databases and sort of perusing them to see if they could actually make matches.
So what I'm trying to figure out is, so where do they get this, again, where do they get the information, and then what do they do with it, and who lets them do it? Are there regulatory bodies they have to work with?
No, especially initially when this movement, this phenomenon really started kind of in the early 90s. There really was no regulatory body at all. In fact, they were just actually getting their information from very traditional sources, microfiche or, newspaper articles or, death notices, just anywhere they could. But the point was when they started compiling these things online, it created something that law enforcement had never done, which is a database that crossed state boundaries. So it was almost like they were responsible for creating this national information source and then for mining it, so to speak, for information.
So tell us, what do these people have in common? First of all, are these individuals for the most part, or are there sort of skeleton crew clubs or groups or organizations that take the lead?
One of the oldest and most established organizations is called the Doe Network, as in Jane and John Doe. And it has thousands of users. Not all of them are actively trying to make matches, but many of them are. There are other databases and websites and bulletin boards called websleuth.com, Can You Identify Me, the Charlie Project. So there are people that sort of ally themselves with these different groups, but it's hard to call them organizations because they are scattered across the country, and a lot of these people have never met face to face. They only know each other by screen names sometimes. What they have in common is that they all seem to be stumble upon these sites to get really challenged by the mystery, because in my book I tell stories that all start with the body being found, and that's just the way CSI starts, or Bones, or any kind of fiction thriller. I think people get sucked into the challenge, the mystery. Who is this person, and how could they not have been identified for so long?
So here's a question. It's almost as if they're treating people as sort of unclaimed property, which I know is a very popular deal right now, to go out and find whether Aunt Susie has left you some money in some state you weren't aware of. But, okay, so let's just say a body is found in Kansas City. And the police, they find a body in a park. So what happens is, A, it's either identified ultimately or not. So the skeleton crew types then keep a record of that, and if it's not identified, then they go to work. Is that how it works?
Pretty much. It's really... numbers are kind of shocking. Actually, that was one of the things that really drove me to write about this subject. Across the country, there are apparently 40,000, some people claim more, sets of unidentified human remains. And some of these cases go back a very long time. But typically, let's say, as you say, in Kansas City, a body is discovered. Typically, the more coroners and medical examiners see about 4,000 bodies in the course of a year. After that year, 1,000 of them are actually still unidentified, and that's why those numbers start to creep up. And what happens to the body can depend on the jurisdiction. There might be a forensic anthropologist if it's very decomposed, or if it's skeletal remains. There could be a forensic anthropologist who does a very thorough going over. In other jurisdictions, they don't have access to that kind of specialist, so there's very little that actually gets recorded about that person.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck here. And again, if you just joined us, Warner Lewis here from the flight deck and on Lewis at Large. And interesting subject indeed. We're talking about a brand new work called The Skeleton Crew by Deborah Halber. She is a journalist by trade, but we are talking specifically about the identification of formerly unidentified dead bodies found across the country. The age of the internet undoubtedly has enhanced and probably caused a huge proliferation of this industry. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think without the internet, this phenomenon would really not have happened.
What about, again, when you interview people, first of all, how did you find them? How did you find those on a skeleton crew?
I, as I'd mentioned, became involved in this topic pretty accidentally. I had seen, in 2010, I saw a photo in the Boston Globe of a woman with kind of long reddish hair and beautiful eyes and this kind of Mona Lisa smile. And then I realized this wasn't a living person, but a digital reconstruction of what this murder victim had looked like before she'd been killed in 1974. And the story went on to say that this woman was only known as the Lady of the Dunes because she'd been found on a beach in Provincetown and she'd never been identified. So then after that, I quickly realized that she wasn't an isolated case. As I mentioned, there are as many as 40,000, or some experts claim even more than 40,000 identified human remains across the U.S. I came across the Doe Network, and then I realized there were people out there who were trying to solve these cases pretty much on their own.
What is, I'm curious as to what local law enforcement, forensics, and maybe even the county coroner for that matter, do they know that there are skeleton crew types on the case that are out there hunting around all the time because they've come to them earlier for information? Or when the skeleton crew somehow does identify somebody, then what do they do?
Yes, they definitely do know, at least in jurisdictions where there are these bodies, that some of them have really sort of captured the public imagination, and they acquire these names. Like I mentioned, Lady of the Dunes. There's another case I write about called Tent Girl. There's one called Princess Doe. The Book in the Box is a really old case from 1957 in Philadelphia. But yes, so in certain areas when people get involved in trying to solve these cases, they do call the local coroner and they do call law enforcement. And sort of varying receptions. To a large law enforcement is not a big fan of what these people are doing. They're kind of suspicious of anybody who's calling about a cold case. But on the other hand, I have spoken to detectives who have come to actually rely on some of these people and say that they would not have identified certain bodies without their help.
All right, question for you. We have, are they only investigating bodies that either, first of all, are all the bodies at some point disposed of? Either meaning are they buried or are they still in theory in a county morgue somewhere?
Again, that really varies by jurisdiction, and some of them are buried in potter's fields. Some of them are literally bones that are kept in the back boxes of morgues. Some of them have been cremated, which is really unfortunate because that's really sending all sort of evidence that might lead to an ID up in smoke, so to speak. And some of them are, but in some jurisdictions, people, even before the advent of DNA, people had kept samples in the hope that there would be a future technology that would help identify some of these people, and that has come to pass.
All right. So if I'm a county coroner and I have a body that I still have in my possession, and a skeleton crew member says, "Hey, I'm Bob Smith. I'm in town here. This is what I do for, quote, a hobby." Why in the world am I in any way, shape, or form have any disposition or any desire to help them out? That doesn't feel like I could understand, I guess, why certain authorities might say, "Forget it. You're a bunch of amateurs just doing this almost for fun."
It does seem that way, but just like the people who get embroiled in these cases, local coroners who have one of these bodies that have been, hanging around their office for sometimes as many as decades, they get involved themselves, and some of them really do welcome the help. It's similar to a situation where law enforcement will put out a bulletin saying, "Can anybody help identify this perpetrator?" They're looking for extra eyes out there who can help them potentially make a match.
Again, we're talking about a work called the Skeleton Crew, and it's a fascinating look into those that seek to identify dead bodies that have not been identified. The work is done by Deborah Halber. She is a journalist by trade. Deborah, curious as to also the reaction of, in most of these cases that they're searching out these identities, are family members aware that these searches are going on in most cases, do you think?
Well, they're obviously family members of the missing who, file missing persons reports and are actively searching for their loved ones. In the case of unidentified people, they may certainly have family and friends. It would be hard to believe that 40,000 people do not have family and friends who are actively searching for them, but they don't know where to look. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea that these databases spanned state lines was kind of huge, because in one case, for instance, a body had been collected from the Gulf of Mexico, and but this woman who had been murdered, it turned out, by her husband and dumped in the Gulf, had been reported missing in the next county, and she wasn't identified for 20 years.
Wow. Okay. Speaking of time, Deborah, tell us this. At what, for most of the people working on most of the Skeleton Crew concept cases, how far back are these? How far back historically are the bodies, so to speak? Meaning, are they still looking for people, for example, or researching things that may have happened as early as, say, the turn of the century, or are these all within the last few years or so for the most part?
The ones that are most well known are some of the ones I mentioned. Like the boy in the box is actually the oldest case that I know about, which I believe is 1957 in Philadelphia, a case of around a boy, maybe 6 years old, who had been seemingly battered and left in a cardboard box in a vacant lot, still unidentified. But the cases that I write about in the book sort of go on from there. There's a well-known one, again, this Massachusetts old oldest unsolved mystery called The Lady of the Dunes. That dates from 1974. I follow the case of a young man who actually does solve a case called Tent Girl, which started in Kentucky in 1968. So these are, for the most part, they're rather cold cases, meaning that they're old. They're not, within the last year or 2 years.
What about, again, this is such a unique profession. Can you stereotype or profile at some level who these people are, age-wise, gender-wise, professionally, retired, young, old, etc.?
Run the gamut. I mean, there are some retirees. There's a few that are, maybe a few years out of college. There are a couple that are still in college and have just gotten obsessed with a certain case that they happen to have written about for another reason. I think what they have in common is that they're all really quite bright. They're detail oriented. They do get very involved in a challenge, and then I think what happens after a while, if they stick with it, I think it becomes a case of compassion, where they really start to feel like they know this person, even though they don't have a name, and they really are complete strangers to them, and they just want to help the family, provide some closure.
What did you, as you looked at all these different people and all the different cases, is there anything in particular that you noticed they all had in common, or was every single case something in a circumstance that was completely different?
They were all, the ones I write about are pretty wildly different. The individuals, as I say, are scattered all across the country. Some of them, I would say, are kind of underemployed. Their day jobs are not that intellectually challenging, and they, this is what they do. It is a hobby, but it's a very time-consuming one and a very serious one. For many of them, they spend many hours a week.
So, as you got into this, I'm curious: did you become more sort of sympathetic or more sort of excited and intrigued about what was going on, or was it what's the lesson that Deborah learned from all this?
I learned that I would make a really lousy web sleuth. It's really intense. It's very draining in a lot of ways. You have to peruse sometimes these things I called Facebooks for the dead, which are basically thumbnail portraits of the unidentified. So there are different ways you can try to put a face to some of these people, which are start out, could be just a skeleton, but there are amazingly talented people out there who could actually create a reconstruction of the person's face based on little more than a skull. Sometimes nothing more than a skull. Sometimes nothing more than a jawbone. It's truly astounding. And there are some real morgue photos up there also. So even just looking at these images is very draining and intense, and it really takes a lot of persistence.
Well, again, and we're talking here about people that are investigating the dead, who they were, where they came from, background, connections, etc. Is there any group, or is there any let's see, how do I put this? Group, organization, individuals, or certain portion of the society that would be actively fighting to have these people stopped? Is there any reason for that?
I have not come across any widespread desire to have them stopped. There is the National Institute of Justice has launched an initiative in the past few years called NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. It's still in a fledgling state. It's not completely populated with information, but it does do exactly what the early web sleuths tried to do on their own, which is to create a national database. It definitely feels like this is the direction it's going. The public is completely able to log on to NAMUS at any time and see most of its contents. So I think this is a trend trend that's going to continue.
Right. Well, again, the work, a new one called The Skeleton Crew by journalist Deborah Halber, will tell you some fascinating stories about those across from coast to coast that are searching and trying to resolve either unsolved deaths, unsolved murders, missing persons to some degree. One final question here, Deborah, before we head out of here, and that is it unique to the United States? I mean, if I go to Europe, are there comparable people over there doing the same thing?
Actually, one of the earliest databases called the Doe Network, as in Jane and John Doe, which is still based in the U.S., actually has a lot of international cases in it itself, and it was overseen for a long time by a woman in Sweden. And Canada actually also has a fairly big effort to do this, as well as there's a lot of attention being paid to the Mexican border when sometimes people try to cross the border and die and are unidentified. It's a very sad circumstance and quite a problem at the border. So yes, there definitely are international efforts along these lines.
Well, we will be watching this one with interest. First time we've ever talked about searching for dead people, at least this way. And a fascinating subject indeed. The work is Skeleton Crew. Hey, Deborah, how can people find out more about the work that you do in your real job and also get a copy of the book?
You should definitely go to my website, which is www.deborahhalber.com. And they should also check out NamUs, namus.gov. And you could look up your state and see all the unidentified remains right in your own area.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing it. The work is an interesting one indeed. What's your next project?
I've actually gotten so contacted by so many people who are affected by this kind of thing, stories that I actually did not know about and are not in the book, that I'd really like to pursue some of these going forward.
All right. Well, listen, again, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.